The dog wouldn't stop staring at her. Not at the food, not at the door, at her. The 76-year-old woman hauling a crate of dishes twice her own body weight across a grease-slicked floor, while a 20-something manager checked his phone 12 feet away. Nathan Cross had survived 2 tours in Fallujah, a collapsed building in Ramadi, and a roadside IED that killed 2 men standing closer to it than he was. He knew how to read a room. He knew when something was wrong before the alarm ever sounded. Atlas knew it too. And Atlas was never wrong. If you've never had a story stop you cold at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels. Because what happened inside Summit Lantern Diner that winter? Nobody saw it coming. Nobody. The storm came in hard from the north, the way Montana winters always did. Without apology, without warning. Just a wall of white dropping out of a sky that had been gray and warning all afternoon and then simply stopped warning and started delivering. By 9:15 p.m., Highway 12 through Silver Ridge had gone from slick to dangerous to something a reasonable person wouldn't attempt in a truck with good tires and a death wish. The temperature had fallen 11 degrees in 40 minutes. Wind gusts out of the Bitterroot Range were clocking 50 miles an hour, and the snowflakes weren't falling so much as being thrown. Horizontal sheets of ice that hit your cheek like fine gravel. Nathan Cross had been driving for 6 hours. He hadn't planned on stopping in Silver Ridge. He hadn't planned on much of anything, which had been the point of the drive to begin with. Since mustering out 18 months ago, he'd gotten comfortable with the idea of not planning, of moving when he felt like moving, of stopping when the road stopped making sense. The road had stopped making sense around milepost 47 when his left rear tire clipped a buried guardrail and the truck shuddered sideways across the ice long enough to remind him, very clearly, that he was not invincible and that dying alone on a Montana highway at 44 because he was too stubborn to pull over would be a genuinely stupid way to end a life that had survived considerably worse. So he pulled into the Summit Lantern Diner. Atlas was already awake in the back seat, head up, ears forward, watching the parking lot through the fogged window with the focused stillness of a dog who had decided something required his attention. He was a German shepherd, 7 years old, 68 pounds of black and tan discipline, and he had been Nathan's fully and completely for the last 4 of those years, starting the day Nathan's therapist had handed him the leash at the intake facility in Missoula and said, with the practiced calm of someone who had seen too many veterans deteriorate without intervention, "He's been waiting for you." Nathan hadn't believed that then. He believed it completely now. "Easy," Nathan said, which was less a command than a reflex. Atlas glanced at him once, acknowledged him, then returned his attention to whatever he was watching through the glass. Nathan followed the dog's gaze. The diner. Summit Lantern had the look of a place that had been built in 1 decade, expanded in 2 others, and repaired in several more. A long, low building with a flat roof and a neon sign that blinked open 24 hours in orange letters, one of which was guttering badly. The parking lot held 6 vehicles. Through the fogged plate glass windows, Nathan could see warm yellow light, a counter with stools, booths along the far wall, and the shapes of people moving inside. He clipped Atlas's vest on. Not the service vest, just the simple black harness with the patch that said "working dog" in reflective letters, which tended to forestall the conversations he didn't want to have, and they went in out of the cold. The smell hit first: coffee, bacon grease, the specific burnt sugar smell of a pie that had been in the oven too long. The warmth came second, the kind of diner warmth that has weight to it, that you feel in your sinuses before you feel it on your skin. Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment and let the cold fall off him. The place was maybe 2/3 full for a Wednesday night in a storm. A family of 4 in a corner booth, the kids coloring on paper placemats. 2 highway patrol guys at the counter with mugs they kept wrapping both hands around. A table of older men in Carhartt jackets who had the look of ranchers who'd been using this particular booth as an unofficial office for 30 years. A young couple in the far booth, talking close and quiet, oblivious to everything. A waitress, mid-20s, high ponytail, slightly frazzled, spotted Nathan and Atlas and made her way over with a menu and a look that was professionally friendly but visibly exhausted. Just the one tonight? Yeah. Dog's okay in here usually, she said. Long as he's trained. He won't be a problem. She nodded, led him to a booth near the window, and dropped the menu. Special tonight's the beef stew. It's actually good. Coffee? Please. She went. Nathan shrugged out of his jacket, hung it on the hook at the end of the booth, and let Atlas settle under the table. The dog lay down, head on his forepaws, but his eyes stayed open, tracking something Nathan couldn't see from this angle. Nathan looked at the menu without reading it. Force of habit. He was scanning the room, the exits, the layout, the people, the sightlines. 2 years out of the Corps, and he still couldn't sit with his back to a door. He'd taken the booth against the wall for exactly that reason, and the window beside him gave him a secondary view of the parking lot, which the part of his brain that never fully came home still needed to know about. The room was ordinary. The people were ordinary. The noise was the comfortable noise of a warm place on a cold night. Low conversation, silverware, the distant rattle of dishes from the kitchen, a radio somewhere playing something country and slow. Then he noticed the chair. It was at the far end of the counter, positioned slightly apart from the stools. Not a stool itself, but an actual chair, a wooden one with a spindle back, sitting where the counter curved toward the kitchen pass-through. There was a coffee mug on the counter in front of it, steaming, full. Nobody was sitting in it. Nathan watched it for a moment. The mug kept steaming. Nobody came to claim it. He was still watching it when the sound started from the back, a rolling, irregular rumbling, growing louder. And then the kitchen door swung open and a woman came through backward, pulling a flat-bottomed cart loaded with a plastic bin of clean dishes stacked 2 feet high. The cart's wheels were fighting her. The bin was tipping. The woman was fighting both of them and winning through sheer refusal to let anything fall. She was old, not old in the way people say when they mean a certain amount of gray in the hair, old the way bodies get when they've worked physical jobs for decades. The slight forward curve of the spine, the deliberate placement of each foot, the way the hands know exactly how much grip to apply because they've miscalculated before and learned. She wore a blue diner apron over a long-sleeve shirt, her white hair pulled back in a bun that had mostly survived the shift, and she moved with the particular efficiency of someone who does not waste motion because they know exactly what each motion costs them. Nathan watched her pull the cart to the dish station near the counter, anchor it with her hip, and start transferring clean dishes to the rack above with steady, unhurried hands. No drama, no asking for help, just work. From under the table, Atlas made a sound. Not a bark, not a whine, something quieter than both. He shifted, stretched his neck out, and stared at her with an intensity Nathan recognized. That's the thing, the dog was saying. That's what I've been watching. Pass bats. The waitress, her name tag said Danny, came back with the coffee. Nathan ordered the beef stew without looking at the menu again. Who's the woman at the dish station? He asked, keeping his voice level. Danny glanced back. Oh, that's Evelyn. She's been here forever. She said it without warmth or dismissal. Just a statement of fact, the way you'd describe the refrigerator or the tile floor. It's always been there. Long shift? She opened this morning. Danny was already moving away, already thinking about the next thing on her list. Nathan looked back at Evelyn. She had finished loading the rack and was now pulling the cart toward the back hall, muscles in her forearms visibly tight with the weight of it. The cart's front wheel caught on the rubber floor mat. She stopped, worked the wheel free with a practiced sideways kick, kept going. The ranchers at their booth didn't look up. The highway patrol guys at the counter didn't look up. The young couple certainly didn't look up. Nathan looked up. He noticed then the empty chair, the steaming mug, the fact that nobody sat in that chair, the fact that nobody moved that mug, the fact that Evelyn, passing the counter on her way back from the hall, paused, just for a half second, barely perceptible, and adjusted the mug a fraction of an inch, aligned it more precisely to the chair's centerline, then kept walking. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't unconscious. It was a ritual. Small, Nathan thought, but rituals always are. The manager came out of the back office at 9:45. He was young, mid-20s maybe, with the particular brand of authority that comes from having been given a title before earning one. Logan Pierce, according to the name badge, assistant manager. He had his sleeves rolled up and his jaw set in a way that advertised he was about to be very important in the next 30 seconds. He walked straight to Evelyn, who was restocking the napkin dispensers along the counter. "The walk-in's a mess," he said. Not loudly, but not quietly either. The kind of volume that lets you pretend you're having a private conversation while ensuring everyone can hear it. "I told you this morning to reorganize the shelves." Evelyn didn't stop what she was doing. "I'll get to it before close, Logan. It needs to be done now. We've got a delivery coming at 6 a.m., and if there's no room, there'll be room." Still calm, still working. "I'll have it done by 11. "I need it done by 10:30. She looked at him then, just briefly, just enough to indicate she'd registered the moved goalpost, and then she looked back at the napkin dispenser. "Then I'll have it done by 10:30. Logan stood there for another few seconds, apparently hoping for something, argument maybe, or acknowledgement of his authority, some kind of declaration that his presence had mattered. He didn't get it. Evelyn had already moved to the next dispenser. He went back to his office. Nathan watched this exchange with the same detached attention he used to apply to post-mission debriefs, cataloging details without yet knowing which ones would turn out to matter. He'd sat in enough after-action reviews to know that the things that seemed small were frequently the things that broke everything, or held everything together, depending on which side of the outcome you were standing on. Atlas, under the table, had not taken his eyes off Evelyn. Birchim. The stew was, in fact, good. Nathan ate slowly and let the warmth settle into him, and he watched the diner work the way he used to watch a forward operating base work, tracking the rhythm of it, who moved where, who made decisions, who compensated for other people's failures. A line cook dropped an entire tray of side plates at 10:15. The crash brought several heads up. Before the cook had finished swearing, Evelyn was there with a broom and dustpan from the station she knew exactly where to find, crouching with visible effort and sweeping broken ceramic off the kitchen floor with the brisk calm of someone who has cleaned up worse things in worse places. "I got it," the cook said, red-faced. "You've got tickets backing up," Evelyn said. She didn't wait for an answer. At 10:30, exactly 10:30, she came out of the walk-in with an empty tote, set it on a shelf, and wrote something on the clipboard hanging by the door. Task complete. She caught no thanks for it because Logan had already forgotten he'd asked for it, because people like Logan always did. Nathan had finished his coffee. He signaled Danny for a refill. "She always worked this late?" he asked when Danny came with the pot. Danny glanced toward the kitchen. "I mean, she's always here. 6 a.m., sometimes earlier. She does inventory, she does setup, she does close some nights when we're short." A pause. "She's kind of... I don't know, she's just here." "What's her last name?" Danny thought for a second, as though surprised anyone had asked. "Brooks, I think." "Yeah, Evelyn Brooks." She topped off the mug and walked away. Nathan looked at the empty chair. The mug in front of it had been refilled at some point, fresh and steaming where it had been cooling an hour ago. He hadn't seen anyone do it. He looked at Atlas. Atlas was sitting up now, ears slightly forward, watching Evelyn move through the dining room collecting cups. The dog's tail hadn't moved, but something in his posture had shifted from watchful to something Nathan didn't have a precise word for. Recognition, maybe. The way the dog looked at things that mattered. "Yeah," Nathan said quietly. "I see her." At 11, Nathan paid his check and left a tip that Danny would consider inexplicably generous. He stood and shrugged into his jacket and looked across the room. Evelyn was wiping down the counter near the pass-through. Her back was to him, her movement slowing with the hour but not stopping. Her right hand gripped the cloth and moved in long, even strokes, and Nathan noticed her stop briefly. Just a pause, a half second. When she reached the empty chair, her hand dropped to the back of it. She didn't grab it. She just rested her palm there, the way you'd touch the shoulder of someone sitting in the seat. A greeting, maybe, or a promise. Then she lifted her hand, picked up the cloth, and kept wiping. Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold pouring in around him. Atlas sat beside him, looking back into the diner, looking at the old woman at the counter. "Okay," Nathan said softly, more to himself than to the dog. Okay. He pushed out into the storm. The cold was brutal after the warmth, a full-body shock that he walked into without flinching. He got Atlas into the truck, started the engine, waited for the heater to kick over. Through the diner's fogged windows, he could still see the warm yellow light, the shapes moving inside. He could see the chair. He sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes without driving anywhere, while the engine warmed and the heater began to push heat and the snow kept coming down sideways out of the Montana dark. He pulled out his phone. He had nothing to look up, no particular reason to stay, nowhere to be in Silver Ridge, and nothing waiting for him on the other side of the pass that couldn't wait another day. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat. That woman opened this diner at 6 a.m., and she's still there at 11 p.m. He ran the math on it without thinking, the same way he used to run ammo counts and exfil distances. 17 hours. Maybe more. On her feet, in a kitchen, hauling freight, absorbing a 25-year-old's impatience. Without complaint. Without anyone, apparently, giving a damn. And that chair. The empty chair and the steaming mug, and the way her hand had come to rest on its back as if it were something sacred. Nathan Cross had survived 2 deployments by paying attention to the things that didn't add up, by asking the question that nobody else was asking because everybody else was too busy or too tired or too certain they already knew the answer. He put the truck in gear. But instead of turning toward the highway and the pass and the road that went away from Silver Ridge, he turned left into the motel parking lot 200 yards down the strip. There was 1 vacancy sign lit. He pulled in. He wasn't sure what he was doing. That was familiar, at least, the feeling of moving toward something without a mission brief, without ROE, without a clear objective. Just the dog's instincts and his own, and the growing certainty that the empty chair in the window of a Montana diner in a blizzard was telling him something. He just didn't know what yet. The motel room smelled like carpet cleaner and old radiator heat, and Nathan lay on top of the covers in his clothes, with Atlas stretched out across the foot of the bed, and he did not sleep for a long time. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the storm work the building, the wind finding every gap around the window frame, the occasional shudder of the roof, the low moan of something metal somewhere in the parking lot being pushed past its tolerance. Outside, Silver Ridge had gone completely quiet under the snow. No traffic, no voices. Just the storm doing what storms did in this part of Montana, which was remind everything living that it was here by sufferance, not by right. He thought about the chair. In the Marines, Nathan had served with men who carried things nobody could see. Not trauma, exactly, or not only trauma, but weight. The specific invisible weight of people who have held something together for so long that the holding becomes the whole of who they are, and you don't notice it until the day they stop, and everything they were holding falls. He had watched a master sergeant in Ramadi run a forward operating base through 3 commander rotations, 2 supply crises, and a week of daily contact, and do it so quietly, so completely, that nobody above him ever fully understood what he was doing. When the man rotated home, the FOB fell apart in 11 days. Not because anyone was incompetent, because the thing he'd been doing was invisible right up until the moment it wasn't there anymore. Nathan understood invisible work. He understood it the way you understand something you've done yourself without credit, because the mission required it and nobody was handing out commendations for keeping a unit functional at 2 in the morning when everything was going sideways. He turned on his side. Atlas adjusted without waking, the empty chair. He closed his eyes and the image stayed. Evelyn's palm on the spindle back. Not gripping, just resting, like a hand on a shoulder, like something that had been done so many times it no longer required thought. He fell asleep sometime around 2 a.m. and dreamed of nothing he remembered. He was up at 5:15, old habit. The Corps had wired him to wake before the alarm, before the light, before anything happened that required him to be awake. He ran water in the sink, looked at his face in the mirror with the same mild disinterest he'd been applying to it for years, and then pulled on his jacket and clipped Atlas's harness. The storm had eased overnight. The parking lot was buried under 14 inches of fresh snow, undisturbed except for tire tracks from a single vehicle that had come through at some point in the early hours. Nathan's truck sat under a clean white layer. He cleared the windshield with his arm, rather than digging out the scraper, which he hadn't thought to buy before driving into Montana in November. He drove to the diner. The parking lot was empty except for one car, a 2003 Honda Civic with a cracked bumper and bald rear tires, parked close to the entrance. The neon open 24 hours sign was lit, but the diner itself was dark except for the kitchen, where light was coming through the pass-through window. Nathan sat in the truck with the engine idling and watched that light for a while. It was 5:47 in the morning. He went in. The front door was unlocked. The dining room was dark and still, and smelled of last night's food and industrial cleaner. And Evelyn Brooks was in the kitchen with the lights on over the prep station, standing at the counter with a clipboard, counting cases of products stacked along the back wall. She was wearing the same blue apron, or one exactly like it. Her white hair was already pinned back. She was writing something on the clipboard with a pen she kept tucking behind her ear and then reaching for again. She heard the door and turned. She looked at Nathan Cross standing in her dark dining room at 5:47 in the morning with a German shepherd and a black harness, and her expression moved through surprise and caution and then settled somewhere practical. "We don't open till 6, she said. "I know." A beat. "You were here last night, counter booth." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment, assessing, not unfriendly, then looked at Atlas. Something in her posture shifted. She had the particular quality of people who pay attention to animals, the instinct to read them before reading the human attached. Atlas was sitting straight, ears forward, looking at her with the focused calm he reserved for things he considered important. "Door's unlocked," she said, turning back to her clipboard. "You want coffee? Machine's on. Mugs are on the rack by the window. Help yourself." She didn't say "I'll make it for you" or "give me a minute." She pointed him at the tools and kept working. Nathan found the mugs. He found the coffee. He poured himself a cup and then, because it felt right, poured a second and brought it into the kitchen and set it on the prep counter 6 feet from where she was working. She glanced at it, then at him. "You make it from the machine?" "Yeah." "That machine makes terrible coffee." "I know. You want it or not?" The faintest suggestion of something crossed her face, not quite a smile. "I'll take it." She picked up the mug without stopping her count. Chan. Nathan sat at the counter with his coffee and waited for the place to wake up, and he watched Evelyn work. She had been there, he would later calculate, since approximately 5 a.m. By the time the first cook arrived at 6:15, a heavy-set man named Roy, who moved with the slow deliberation of someone whose knees had been complaining for years, Evelyn had already completed a full inventory check, restocked the dry goods shelf, pulled the prep list, started 2 pots of soup stock, and swept the walk-ins floor because, as she mentioned to nobody in particular, someone had tracked something in from the loading dock and it would need to pass the health inspector's eye next Tuesday. Roy came in, looked at the prep list already filled out in Evelyn's handwriting, and said, "Morning, Ev." "Morning." She didn't look up from the stock pot. He tied on his apron and started cracking eggs for the morning rush. That was all. That was the entirety of the acknowledgement. Danny came in at 6:30, looking like she hadn't slept well, and found the syrup dispensers already filled and the coffee station already stocked, and she poured herself a cup and drank half of it before saying anything. What she said was, "Is the banana bread out?" "Counter," Evelyn said, from the dish station. Danny went and got a piece. Nathan watched all of this with the calm, cataloging attention of a man who has spent years being paid to notice the things that happen in the margins. What he was noticing was this. Every morning task that made the diner function, every prep item, every stocked station, every task that the opening crew would have spent their first 45 minutes scrambling to complete was already done, had been done before any of them arrived. The whole engine had been oiled and started by a 76-year-old woman working alone in the dark while the rest of Silver Ridge slept. And nobody said thank you. They didn't say it the way you don't say thank you to a light switch, not out of ingratitude exactly, but out of the deep human capacity to stop seeing the things that are always there. Logan Pierce arrived at 7:50, 10 minutes before his shift technically started, which Nathan had already understood meant Logan considered himself 10 minutes early. He had a coffee from somewhere else in his hand, which said something about his relationship with the diner's machine. He walked through the dining room, which was now filling with the breakfast crowd, and paused when he saw Nathan in the corner booth with the dog. "You were in last night," he said. "Yeah." Logan looked at Atlas. "He's not going to be a problem?" "He's not." Logan seemed to weigh this, decided it wasn't worth the energy, and moved toward his office. Halfway there, he stopped and turned. Evelyn was clearing a table near the window. "Evelyn, the men's room sink is draining slow again. I need that fixed before the lunch rush." "I'll call Glenn. Glenn said last time he can't come out same day. Then I'll fix it myself." Logan stared at her. "You know how to unblock a drain?" Evelyn picked up the last cup from the table, stacked it on her tray. "Vinegar and baking soda, let it sit 20 minutes, plunger. If that doesn't do it, the drain snake's in the utility closet behind the mops." Logan opened his mouth, closed it. He seemed to be processing the fact that not only did Evelyn know how to do the thing, she clearly had done it before, had a supply list, and knew exactly where the tools lived. "Right," he said. "Well, do that before 10. "I'll do it now." She walked past him with the tray. Logan stood in the middle of the dining room for a moment in the particular way of people who have just been preempted and are deciding whether to make something of it. He decided not to. He went to his office and closed the door. Nathan looked down at Atlas. Atlas was looking at Evelyn. He came back every morning for 5 days. He told himself it was the road conditions, and that was partly true. Highway 12 over the pass had been closed for 2 of those days following an avalanche on the western approach, which had technically trapped everyone in Silver Ridge who had somewhere else to be. Nathan didn't technically have somewhere else to be, which made the distinction academic. He stayed at the Valley Rest Motel. He paid for a week in advance because it was cheaper that way. He ate breakfast at the Summit Lantern every morning. He ordered coffee and whatever the day's special was, and he sat in the same corner booth and he read nothing, scrolled nothing, and paid attention. What he learned about Evelyn Brooks in 5 days of paying attention could fill a narrow notebook. She drank her coffee black and never sat down to drink it. Always standing, always at the counter, always with the mug in one hand and something else in the other, reading a prep list or making a notation on the inventory or wiping a surface that didn't need wiping yet but would need it soon. She knew every regular by name. Not just their orders, their names, and the auxiliary information attached to those names. That Bob Pruitt's hip had been bad since October. That the Hendersons were driving to Billings for their daughter's recital on Saturday. That a man who came in every Thursday named Dell had been looking for work since the feed store closed and needed to hear someone ask how the search was going without pity in their voice. Nathan watched her deliver this small, specific attention to person after person without any visible sense of performance. She just knew. She remembered. She asked the right question and then listened to the answer instead of already moving on to the next thing. She secretly paid for other people's food. He figured this out on day 3. A teenage boy came in alone at 7:30, sat at the counter, looked at the menu for a long time, and then ordered just coffee. He was maybe 16, thin in the way of kids who weren't eating enough, and he nursed the coffee until 9 and then started getting up to leave. Evelyn appeared beside him from somewhere and said something very quiet. Nathan couldn't hear it. The kid hesitated. Evelyn went to the kitchen and came back in 4 minutes with a full breakfast plate, eggs, toast, hash browns, and set it in front of him. She said something else. The kid sat back down and ate. Nathan watched her go to the register and write something in a notebook she kept under the counter. Not the register's notebook. Her own. He saw her put a bill in the register from her apron pocket. He was careful not to show that he'd seen. On day 4, he noticed something he should have noticed sooner. The empty chair at the counter had a thin layer of dust on the seat. But the mug, refreshed every single morning, Nathan had now confirmed, watching for it, never had a drop of dust. The mug was handled daily, the chair was not, which meant she wasn't maintaining both. She was maintaining the presence of someone. The refreshed coffee was for them. The untouched chair was for them. The ritual was not about the furniture. It was about the promise to keep showing up. Atlas spent each morning lying beside Evelyn's feet during her break, which she took standing up at the counter. She had started scratching behind his ears without comment, the way she did everything, without announcement, without making it into a moment, just a thing happening that both parties had apparently agreed to. "What's his name?" she asked Nathan on the fourth morning, not looking up from her clipboard. "Atlas. Like the map. Like the myth." She glanced up at that briefly, then back down. "The one holding everything up." "Yeah." A pause. The pen scratched across the clipboard. "That's a lot to put on a dog." "He handles it." She made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something else, and went back to her count. The notebook appeared by accident on day 5. Nathan was at his usual booth when Evelyn reached into her apron pocket for a pen, and the pocket caught on the apron string and the whole contents of the pocket spilled. The pen, a folded paper, a rubber band, and a small notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that used to come in school supply packs. It hit the floor and opened. Nathan was out of his booth before he'd decided to move. Old reflex, the urge to help before the brain weighs whether helping is welcome. He picked it up and saw, in the half second before he handed it back, that the open page was filled from margin to margin with names and handwritten annotations. Not a list exactly, more like entries. A name, a date, a line or two of text in small, precise handwriting. He handed it back. Evelyn took it without drama, checked that nothing else had fallen, tucked everything back into her pocket. She didn't explain the notebook. She didn't thank him for picking it up. She just went back to the table she was cleaning. But he'd seen enough. Henderson R. March 2019. Lost the truck. Stayed 3 nights. I covered the meal. Working in Billings now, called last spring. Marguerite T. October 2016. Kid sick. Needed money for pharmacy. Gave what I had. She paid it back 2 years later. Didn't have to. Luis and crew. Winters 2014 to 2018. Cold. Nowhere to go after the highway closures. Kept the corner table open. He hadn't seen the other entries. But those 3 were enough to understand what the notebook was. It was an account, not a financial one. The account of a life lived in the margins of other people's harder moments, documented not for credit, but for the same reason soldiers kept after-action notes, because someone had to keep track of what happened, or it would be as if it never had. Nathan sat back down at his booth. Atlas had his head tilted, watching him. "I know," Nathan said quietly. "I know." The confrontation happened on day 6, in the middle of the Friday breakfast rush. The diner was packed, every booth full, 3 people standing near the entrance waiting for tables, both register lines backed up. Roy was managing the grill with the focused aggression of a man at maximum capacity, and Danny and the other waitress, a young woman named Kelsey, new, still learning the table numbering, were moving as fast as they could move, which was not fast enough. Evelyn was everywhere. She was bussing tables, running food, refilling coffee, covering the gaps that Kelsey kept leaving because Kelsey hadn't yet developed the spatial awareness to track 6 tables simultaneously. She did it without comment, without redirecting blame, just filling the holes as they opened. Nathan watched her carry a full tray of food from the pass-through to booth 7, while simultaneously telling a waiting customer there would be a table in 3 minutes with enough calm certainty that the customer sat back down and waited. Logan was at the register, dealing with a complaint from a man in a Stetson about an overcharge. He looked up, saw the dining room chaos, and, rather than coming out to help, called across the floor to Evelyn. "Evelyn, booth 4 hasn't been cleared yet." Evelyn was already en route to booth 4 with a bus tray. She didn't answer. "I need that cleared now. We've got people waiting." "Working on it," she said, without turning. "You should have had that done 10 minutes ago." She set the bus tray down on booth 4 and began stacking dishes with both hands moving in efficient practice sequence, cups nested, plates stacked by size, silverware gathered in a single pass. Logan was still talking. "I keep telling you the system is you clear a table the second they leave, not—" "Logan," her voice was even. "Not sharp, not hard, just clear. The way you'd speak to stop an unnecessary briefing. I have it. Let me work." The man in the Stetson at the register was watching this. Several customers were watching it. Logan seemed to feel the weight of the audience and recalibrate. "I'm just saying we need to stay on top of—" "Then help me." Still even. Still clear. She picked up the full bus tray without apparent strain and looked at him for one direct second. There's an apron on the hook. Logan's jaw moved. He went back to the register. Nathan had his coffee mug halfway to his mouth, and he set it back down without drinking. Across the diner, Danny caught his eye. She gave the very smallest shrug, the shrug of a person who has witnessed this dynamic enough times to have feelings about it that she no longer has the energy to act on. Evelyn carried the bus tray to the station, rinsed it, and was back on the floor in 40 seconds. The Booth 4 couple was seated 60 seconds after that. He found her at her car at 3 in the afternoon. She was loading a cardboard box into the back seat, the kind of box that grocery stores give away, flat-bottomed, logo on the side. Nathan had seen her leave the diner with it, and he'd given it 2 minutes before following, because walking straight out after her would have been obvious. He found her in the parking lot with the car door open and the box mostly loaded, and she looked up when she heard him coming, and she didn't look surprised, which made him think she'd known he'd be following. "You've been coming in every morning for a week," she said. "Storm's been cleared for 3 days." "I know." She studied him, not wary exactly, more the way you look at something you haven't categorized yet. "What do you want?" He hesitated. In the core, Nathan had been direct by training and by preference. He had operated in environments where indirection wasted time and time was measured in who made it home. He was not by nature a person who circled around things, but he'd been trying to work out, for the better part of 5 days, how to say what he wanted to say to a 76-year-old woman who clearly had no use for being managed. "I noticed some things," he said. "People generally don't. I was trained to." She looked at the harness on Atlas, at the set of Nathan's jaw, at the particular stillness of him that was not peace but the thing that had learned to look like peace. She nodded, very slightly, in a way that indicated she understood what kind of trained. "Marines? 18 years." She closed the car door. She looked at him steadily. "And what did you notice, Marine?" "That you run this place, not Logan, not the cooks, you. And that nobody here, far as I can tell, knows that, or knows to care." He paused. "And that there's a chair in there that nobody sits in and a mug that somebody keeps filling, and it's not any of the staff." The parking lot was very quiet. The cold pressed in from all sides. A gust moved through and lifted a strand of white hair across Evelyn's forehead, and she pushed it back with the automatic efficiency of a person who doesn't let minor things interrupt conversations. She looked at him for a long moment. "The box is for the Kellner kids," she said. "Their dad's been out of work since September. I put together what was going to get thrown out anyway." She tapped the top of the box. "I do it most Fridays." She wasn't deflecting. She was just telling him something else true, as if the two things, his question and her answer, were part of the same conversation. Which maybe they were. "You have been coming into my diner every morning," she said, "and sitting in that corner booth and watching me." "Yes." "That should bother me more than it does." She bent down and looked at Atlas, and the dog looked calmly back. "He's a good dog. The best I've known." She straightened. The winter light was low and flat, and it fell across the lines of her face in a way that made her look like a photograph of herself, something documentary and precise and quietly extraordinary. She picked up her keys from the car door. "I have to get this to the Kellners before the kids get home from school," she said. "They eat better when it's there before they see it's needed." She paused. "If you're going to keep sitting in my diner, you might as well order something besides coffee." She got in the car. "You look like you haven't had a real meal in longer than this week." She pulled out of the parking lot without waiting for him to answer. Nathan stood in the cold with Atlas and watched the Civic's cracked bumper disappear around the corner onto 2nd Street. He should have been on the road 3 days ago. He didn't have a job waiting. He didn't have family waiting. He had an apartment in Missoula with a lease that renewed automatically, and a therapist he saw every other Thursday, and a life that was quietly, stubbornly, refusing to take any particular shape since he'd come home from the last deployment, and found that the shape he'd had before, Marine, unit, mission, structure, had been the whole architecture, and without it, he was just a man in a room who didn't know what to do with quiet. He looked at the corner where the Civic had gone. He looked at Atlas. The dog was sitting, calm and alert, in the middle of the empty parking lot. He had the particular posture of a dog who has been waiting for someone to understand something and is prepared to wait as long as it takes. "Okay," Nathan said. "We're staying." He pulled out his phone and called the motel to extend for another week. The snow started again that evening, lighter than before, the kind of fine, dry snow that fell straight down in the still air and made the whole town look like a photograph taken through gauze. Nathan walked Atlas along the empty main street of Silver Ridge at 6 p.m. and let the dog set the pace and looked at the town around him. It was the kind of small town that had been large once, or at least larger. He could see it in the architecture, the bones of buildings that had been built with ambition and then maintained with diminishing resources as the decades thinned. The hardware store, the pharmacy, a bar with a hand-lettered sign, 2 churches within a block of each other, both small. And at the end of the strip, visible from everywhere on the main drag, the Summit Lantern Diner with its blinking orange sign, warm and lit against the dark. He stopped in front of a window that had been boarded over and saw his reflection in the plywood, faint and winter-lit. And behind his reflection he saw, or imagined he saw, the diner 2 blocks back, the light in its windows, the woman inside who arrived before anyone else and left after everyone else, and spent the hours in between keeping something alive that nobody had bothered to look at closely enough to understand. He thought about what she'd said. "I have to get this to the Kellners before the kids get home from school. They eat better when it's there before they see it's needed." That sentence had been staying with him since the parking lot. The operational precision of it, not charity as gesture, but charity calibrated for outcome. Understanding that dignity was part of the delivery, that the thing mattered, but the how of the thing mattered just as much. He thought about the notebook, the names and dates and outcomes, maintained across years with the same steady hand. He thought about the chair. He turned around and walked back toward the diner. He wasn't going in. It was after close for the dinner seating. He just walked back until he could see it clearly. The sign, the windows, the warm orange light. Through the glass, just barely, he could make out a shape at the counter. Still there. He stood in the snow for a minute, just looking. "She doesn't know what she is," he said to Atlas quietly. Atlas looked up at him, then back at the diner. No, Nathan thought, that wasn't right either. She knew exactly what she was. What she didn't know, what nobody had ever apparently taken the time to tell her, was that anyone else could see it. He turned and walked back to the motel through the fine, straight-falling snow, and he was already thinking about what came next, and what he would need to find out, and how you went about documenting something that had been made invisible on purpose, not by malice, but by the slower, deeper cruelty of being taken for granted until you barely existed in the accounting of the people who needed you most. He was a Marine. He knew how to run reconnaissance. He was going to find out exactly who Evelyn Brooks was, and then he was going to make sure somebody remembered. He started with the oldest residents. Silver Ridge was the kind of town where institutional memory lived in people rather than records, in the men who still met at the same table every morning, and the women who had worked the same church auxiliary for 40 years, and anyone over 60 who had been here long enough to remember when the diner had a different sign and different hours and a different name on the deed. Nathan was methodical about it. He had run enough human operations to know that you didn't walk into a small town and start asking pointed questions about a specific person unless you wanted doors to close faster than they opened. You started broad. You let the conversation find its own level. You listened more than you talked, and you paid attention to what people circled around without naming, because those were always the things that mattered. He started at the hardware store on Monday morning, buying a set of tire chains he didn't strictly need, and spent 20 minutes talking to the owner, a man named Carl Briggs, 68, whose family had been in Silver Ridge for 3 generations, about the storm damage to local properties, and then about the town generally, and then, when it came naturally, about the diner. Carl's face changed in a specific way when the Summit Lantern came up. Not dramatic, just warmer. The way a face changes when it lands on something it considers reliable. "Been going there my whole life, pretty much," Carl said, feeding chain links through his hands. "My dad used to take me Saturday mornings, back when Harold Mercer ran it." Harold Mercer, Nathan repeated, founded the place. Back in God must have been the early 70s. He and his wife, and then later... Carl paused, glanced up. You know Evelyn? I've met her. Carl set the chains down. He looked at Nathan with the particular evaluating look of a man trying to determine whether a stranger was worth the full story. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. Evelyn was there from the beginning. I mean, nearly. She came in, this would have been 78, 79, as a short order cook, I think. Or maybe she was waitressing, I can't remember. But she and Harold, they were partners in running that place even when she wasn't on the deed. Everybody knew it. He picked the chains up again. Harold died in 2004. His kids sold the place to the current owners about 10 years later, but Evelyn stayed. Why? Carl looked at him. Why does anybody stay anywhere? He shrugged. It's hers, not legally, but it's hers. Nathan paid for the chains and walked back to his truck and sat for a minute. 40-some years. She'd been in that building for 40-some years, and the current management had come in a decade ago and inherited her the way they'd inherited the coffee machine and the booths. As a fixture, a feature, a thing that was simply part of the property. He drove back to the diner and ordered eggs. He found other sources over the following days. A retired schoolteacher named Margaret, who had been eating at the Summit Lantern every Tuesday for 20 years, told him about a winter in 2011 when a family, mother, 4 kids, their car packed with everything they owned, had stopped at the diner after their heat had been shut off and they had nowhere to go. Evelyn had fed them, located a woman in town with a spare room, and found 2 space heaters from somewhere. The family's oldest kid is working in Billings now, Margaret said. He came back and had dinner at the diner last year, specifically to see her. Evelyn didn't even remember the details. She had to be reminded. A mechanic named Darnell told Nathan about a period in 2015 when the diner had been struggling financially. The corporate owners at the time had been running it into the ground, and Evelyn had organized the regulars into essentially keeping the place alive by showing up, spreading the word, and in at least 2 cases that Darnell knew of, paying for things out of pocket when the supply deliveries came up short. She doesn't do any of this for attention, Darnell said. He had a wrench in one hand and an expression of someone who had given this thought. That's the thing. She'd hate that we're talking about her. She'd say we got it wrong. Would she be right? About the details, maybe? About the picture? He turned back to the truck he was working on. No, I think we got that right. Nathan also talked to the truckers. He found them at the diner's counter on Thursday morning. 3 men who had the look of long-haul drivers on a regular route, the kind who treated certain diners as fixed points in a world of moving parts. They were older, all 3 of them, late 50s or early 60s, with the particular weather-worn competence of people who have spent decades moving freight across hundreds of miles of American road. They had the easy familiarity of men who had sat in the same seats many times before. Their names were Mick, Dave, and a man everyone called Catfish for reasons nobody had explained and Nathan didn't ask about. He sat one stool down and let the conversation find its way there naturally, which took about 12 minutes. Evelyn saved my route once, Mick said, unprompted, after Nathan had been listening long enough that they'd stopped noticing him. I mean, literally, I was stuck here. This was maybe 2017, big ice storm. Highway was closed. Company was threatening to pull my contract because the delivery was late. I was on the phone with dispatch, losing my mind. Evelyn got on the phone with the company. Catfish looked up. She talked to your dispatch? She got the number off my phone, called them, explained the road closure, cited the actual highway patrol bulletin, and got me a 24-hour extension. Mick shook his head. She just did that. I didn't ask her to. She heard me losing it in the corner, and she just went and handled it. She used to keep track of the highway reports, Dave said. She had a radio in the back, and she'd listen to the DOT updates during the bad weeks, and she'd flag down drivers she knew if there was something closing ahead. Saved a couple guys from some bad situations. Nathan thought of the notebook, the names and dates and outcomes. He thought of the after-action instinct of it, the systematic recording of what worked and what was needed and who had needed it, maintained across years with the same steady purpose. He thought about what kind of person did that. Not instinctively but deliberately, over decades, in the interstices of a job that paid her barely enough to own a car with tires that needed replacing. "She known any of your routes personally?" he asked, keeping it casual. "Family connections? Anything like that?" Mick looked at him for the first time with real attention. "Her husband was a driver, long haul, been dead 15 years, maybe more. Samuel Brooks." He paused. "Samuel was a good man, good driver. We knew him." Dave nodded. He had his coffee mug in both hands and he was looking at it. "Sam used to come in at the end of every run and sit at the counter, same spot. They didn't make a big deal of it, Evelyn and him. She'd bring him coffee and they'd talk for a bit and then he'd go and she'd keep working. It was just," he seemed to search for the word, "steady, you know, like something you could count on." Nathan looked at the counter, at the chair. "That his chair?" he asked. Nobody answered for a second. "Yeah," Catfish said, quiet. "That's his chair, Saad." He was running reconnaissance, and he knew it. The old habits were useful here. In the field, you built a picture from fragmented inputs, partial reports, incomplete observation, second-hand accounts, things that were true and things that were almost true and things that were believed true without evidence. You triangulated. You looked for the places where independent sources agreed without having coordinated, because those were the truest data points you had. You built a map of the territory before you committed to a course of action, because the map wasn't the territory, but it was the best tool you had. The picture he was building of Evelyn Brooks was one of those pictures that came together with unusual coherence. The sources agreed. The timelines tracked. The details corroborated one another across people who had no reason to coordinate their stories because they didn't know they were contributing to a collective account. She had been inside the Summit Lantern for 45 years. She had, in that time, fed people who were hungry and sheltered people who were cold and coached and supported and connected and maintained at least several dozen lives in the way that quiet people in small towns sometimes do, not by declaring themselves essential, but by simply being there, being competent, being available, being the kind of person you called when you didn't know who else to call. And she had done all of this while holding a job that paid her hourly and offered no benefits and no formal recognition and no security against the day, not far off, Nathan understood, when her body would simply stop being able to do what she asked of it. He thought about the walk-in at 5 a.m. He thought about her hands on the inventory cart, the muscle in her forearms, the way her movements had begun to slow by late afternoon in a way she clearly refused to acknowledge. He thought about Logan Pierce calling across a packed dining room to criticize the pace of her table clearing. He sat in the motel room on Thursday night with his notebook on his knee. His own notebook, the one he'd had since Missoula, where his therapist had told him to write things down when they mattered. And he looked at the notes he'd taken and thought about what reconnaissance was for. It wasn't for the knowing. That had never been the point. The point was always the action. The intel briefing led to the mission plan. The map led to the movement. You gathered information so that you could do something with it that was worth the gathering. He needed to figure out what to do with this. The accident happened on a Saturday. Nathan was at his usual booth, post-breakfast, working on his third cup of the terrible coffee, which he had developed a tolerance for over 2 weeks, when he heard it, not a crash exactly, but a sequence of sounds that added up to one. A stumble, a grunt, the percussive impact of a cardboard box hitting a tile floor, and then the specific clatter of multiple smaller items cascading in several directions. He was up and moving before the second echo. The hallway to the storage room was narrow and dim, and Evelyn was on one knee in the middle of it, breathing carefully through her nose, one hand on the floor and one hand gripping the collapsed edge of the cardboard box she'd been carrying. Its contents were spread across 6 feet of corridor. Canned goods, a stack of old folders, 2 canvas bags, and a cascade of photographs that had fanned across the tile in a rough semicircle around her. "Don't," she said, before Nathan had covered half the distance. He stopped. She looked up at him. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were clear, and her expression was the expression of someone who is in some amount of pain and is deeply committed to not making it anyone else's problem. "I've got it," she said. "You're on the floor, Evelyn." "I'm aware of that." She shifted her weight, testing something. Her left knee, Nathan registered, the way she'd gripped it briefly before releasing. "I slipped on the mat edge. It's happened before. Has it? I'm fine. He didn't move closer. He didn't offer a hand. He had enough sense to understand that the wrong kind of help was worse than no help, and that a woman who had been operating independently for 76 years did not want to be lifted off the floor like a child. He crouched and started collecting photographs from the tile within his reach, the simple practical act of reducing the mess, of making the recovery easier without making it his. She watched him for a second, apparently recalibrating. Then she started gathering photographs on her side. They worked in silence for a minute. Nathan picked up a photograph and looked at it without meaning to, and then looked at it deliberately, because what he saw stopped him. It was old. Color photograph, but the color had shifted toward yellow and amber in the way of prints from the early 80s. Two people in front of the diner he recognized, the building, the sign, though the sign said Mercer's Lantern instead of Summit. A man, heavy-set, broad-shouldered, with a wide smile and paint on his shirt, and beside him a woman, maybe 30, dark-haired, straight-backed, with a cloth apron tied around her waist, and her hands at her sides, and an expression that was not quite a smile but was something better. Satisfaction, maybe. The look of someone who has just finished something hard and has come out the other side and knows it. The woman was Evelyn. Nathan set the photograph aside and picked up another. Same era. The diner's counter, recognizable, same bones, with 4 people in it, 3 of them customers, and one of them Evelyn, younger, taking an order, laughing at something, her whole face different with it. Then another. Evelyn and the big man, Harold Mercer, Nathan assumed, standing over an open hood of a truck, both of them looking at something mechanical with expressions of serious concern. Then another, the dining room strung with some kind of decoration, the booths full, and Evelyn in the middle of it all with the look of someone who has organized a thing and is watching it go. There were dozens of them. He gathered them carefully, without comment, stacking them by shape and size. Evelyn, beside him, was doing the same, and she wasn't looking at them. Or she was, but she was looking at them the way you look at things you know so well they don't surprise you anymore. Storage box, she said. She nodded toward the collapsed box. It's been in the back room since a while. I was bringing it out to give to the Historical Society. The town's putting together a display on local businesses. A pause. I kept forgetting to take it. Can I see? She looked at him. A long look. The kind that isn't deciding whether to trust, but deciding whether the sharing was worth what it cost. Help me up first, she said. He stood and offered his hand. She took it, firm grip, no hesitation, and came to her feet in the careful way of someone being precise about weight distribution. She let go immediately. She straightened her apron. Then she gathered the photographs into a stack and turned to the light from the doorway and held them out. He took them. He went through them slowly, giving each one actual attention, and Evelyn stood beside him and said nothing, which was itself a kind of trust. The photographs covered 40 years. The diner at different stages, different booths, different countertops, the kitchen visible in some shots with equipment that changed across the decades. People Nathan didn't know, some of them clearly regulars in their era, some of them clearly travelers stopping through. Evelyn in her 30s, her 40s, her 50s, always in motion in the photographs, the way she was always in motion in the diner. Never posed, never performing, always in the middle of doing something. And then, in a sequence that Nathan felt the weight of before he fully understood why, a series of photographs that included a third figure, a lean, dark-eyed man with a trucker's build, wide through the shoulders, specific kind of tired in the face that came from highway miles, who appeared in maybe 15 shots across what looked like 20 years, always at the counter, always with Evelyn, always with the particular quality of 2 people in each other's presence so naturally that the photographs barely noticed it. Samuel Brooks. In the last photograph of him, he was sitting in the chair, not the stool. The wooden chair with the spindle back, positioned where the counter curved. He was sitting in it with a cup of coffee in front of him and his head turned toward the kitchen, and Evelyn was visible through the pass-through, just her hands and the edge of her profile, doing something at the prep station. Neither of them was looking at the camera. Neither of them knew the photograph was being taken. Nathan held that one for a long moment. That was his regular seat, Evelyn said. Her voice was level. He'd pull the chair up at the end of every long run. I'd hear the door and I'd know, without looking, because the chair made a sound on that floor. It was loose on one leg. We kept meaning to fix it. A pause. Samuel fixed everything in this building eventually except that chair. Nathan set the photograph carefully at the top of the stack. You still hear the door the same way? She was quiet for several seconds. Sometimes, she said. The hallway was very still. From the dining room came the ordinary sounds of a Saturday lunch service building toward full capacity, voices layered over silverware over the kitchen rhythm, and it all seemed very far away and very close simultaneously. What was he like? Nathan asked. It was, he understood, a risk. You didn't ask that question without accepting whatever answer came with it. But he'd gotten enough in 2 weeks to understand that Evelyn Brooks had been carrying something for 15 years that had never been asked about properly, and the weight of unasked things had a way of compounding. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the photographs in Nathan's hands. Reliable, she said. That was the main thing. Not exciting. He'd probably tell you himself. Something moved across her face. He drove the same route for 22 years. I-90 to Spokane, up through Coeur d'Alene, back down. Every run. He knew every mile of it. He knew the bad patches in winter and the construction schedules and the truck stops that were worth stopping at and the ones that weren't. She paused. I always knew when he'd be back within about 30 minutes, one way or another. We never needed to talk much when he came in. He'd sit down and I'd bring the coffee and we'd just... She stopped, started again. Be in the same place. After all those miles, that was the thing. Nathan said nothing. She reached over and took the photographs back. She held them against her chest, not looking at them anymore. The chair's the same one, she said. I had it reupholstered once. The frame's original. I keep the coffee warm because... She stopped herself. She looked at the floor for a moment, and when she looked up, her expression had changed slightly. Not cracked, not soft, but honest in the way of someone who has decided that the pretense of not feeling costs more than it's worth. I don't know why I keep the coffee warm. It doesn't make sense. It makes sense, Nathan said. She looked at him. It makes sense, he repeated. She held his eyes for a moment longer than she usually did, and then she nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that closed the subject without dismissing it, and bent to pick up the canvas bags from the floor. I need to get these to the storage room, she said, and then the lunch rush is going to hit in about 20 minutes. I'll carry those. She considered this, decided it was practical rather than charity. Down the hall, last door on the left. He was carrying the second canvas bag back from the storage room when he heard Logan's voice from the kitchen. Not shouting, but close to it, the compressed, high-pressure sound of someone working very hard to keep a bad temper just below the threshold of what could be reported. Nathan slowed. I don't care what you were doing. The lunch station should have been reset an hour ago. Evelyn's voice, even. I was dealing with something in storage. It's reset now. That's not the point. The point is there's a system and you keep operating outside of it like the rules don't... Logan, calm, clear. The station is set. The lunch rush is covered. What else do you need? I need you to understand that you can't just disappear for 45 minutes without... I slipped, she said. A pause. What? I slipped on the mat edge by the storage room. I fell. I needed a few minutes. Her voice was still even, but Nathan caught something underneath it. Not fragility, not quite. More like the sound of a person who has told the precise truth and is waiting to see what gets done with it. The pause this time was longer. Are you okay? Logan asked. It came out differently than his previous sentences, less constructed, more like he'd said it before he'd had time to decide what a manager was supposed to say. I'm fine. Nathan heard Logan start to say something and then stop. He heard the kitchen sounds refill the silence, the grill, the exhaust fan, Roy's rhythmic movement at the prep station. The mat edge has been a problem for a while, Logan said. It wasn't quite an apology, but it wasn't nothing either. I've mentioned it, Evelyn said. Another pause. I'll get it replaced this week. Thank you. Footsteps. Logan's office door. Nathan stood in the hallway with the canvas bag and did not go into the kitchen. He gave it a full minute, counting seconds the way he'd counted them in Overwatch positions, and then he walked in and set the bag by the storage counter and said nothing. Evelyn was at the prep station. She had a cutting board in front of her and a knife in her hand, and she was working through a pile of onions with the fast, precise rhythm of someone who has cut 1,000 pounds of onions and doesn't need to look at what her hands are doing. Her eyes were wet. Onions. Probably onions. He didn't say anything about it. He washed his hands at the sink and picked up a cutting board from the rack and stood beside her. "What do you need cut?" She looked at him sideways. "Peppers," she said after a moment. "Red and green, strips." He found the peppers. He found a knife. He started cutting. They worked side by side for several minutes in silence, the two of them, and the lunch rush came up around them like a tide. He found the notebook the following Tuesday. Not the marbled cover notebook from her pocket, a different one. This one was larger, spiral-bound, the kind you could buy at any drugstore, and it was in the canvas bag he'd carried to storage, which had come open in the carrying and disgorged its contents across the shelf when he'd set it down too fast. He'd been meaning to mention it to Evelyn. He hadn't found the right moment. He mentioned it Tuesday morning, setting the bag on the counter in front of her. "This came open Saturday. I stacked everything back, but I wasn't sure I got it in the right order." She looked in the bag, took out the spiral notebook, flipped it open, checked the contents, seemed satisfied that it was intact. Then she set it on the counter between them. "These are the people Harold asked me to keep track of," she said, "back when he first got sick. He was worried about... There were people who depended on the diner, employees mostly, but also regulars who didn't have family nearby. He wanted someone watching." She paused. "I kept going after he was gone." Nathan looked at the notebook. "Can I?" he asked. She slid it toward him. He opened it. The handwriting was the same precise hand as the marbled notebook. Consistent, almost architectural, the penmanship of someone trained to it in an era before keyboards. The entries went back to 2004. Names, dates, circumstances, outcomes. Some entries were short. A name, a date, helped with rent, February, paid back April. Some were long, paragraph length, with follow-up notes added in different ink at different times. The notations of someone who tracked not just the moment, but the arc. He turned pages slowly. The notebook was 3/4 full. There were, by his rough estimate, somewhere north of 200 entries. 200 people. He thought about the men at the bar who'd mentioned her in passing, the mechanic who'd called her impossible to thank properly, the truckers who'd sat with their coffee and spoken about Samuel's chair with the careful reverence of men who didn't have the vocabulary for what they felt, but felt it anyway. 200 people, documented in a spiral notebook in the storage room of a diner, maintained over 20 years by a woman who was still on her feet at this hour, restocking the syrup dispensers, and would be here long after closing and would be back before dawn. He closed the notebook. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. He held the notebook up. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say yet, but he knew the shape of it, the shape of what he'd spent 2 weeks building toward, and he knew it was time to say it. "Do any of these people know this exists?" She looked at the notebook. Something in her expression shifted. Not uncomfortable exactly, but the look of someone who has been asked about something they have never been asked about before and are genuinely uncertain how to answer. "No," she said. "That wasn't the point of it." "I know it wasn't," Nathan said. "But here's the thing, Evelyn." He set the notebook back on the counter. "You've been keeping records this whole time, so have I." He reached into his jacket and brought out his own notebook, the one from Missoula, the one his therapist had given him for things that mattered. He set it beside hers, and I think it's time somebody did something with both of them. She looked at the two notebooks side by side on the counter. She looked at Nathan. She looked at Atlas, who was sitting quietly at Nathan's feet with his ears slightly forward. She picked up her notebook and held it for a moment. Then she set it back down and slid it a few inches toward Nathan's side of the counter. It was not a gift. It wasn't permission, exactly. It was more like the action of a person who has decided very quietly that something has gone on long enough, being unseen, being uncounted, being the one who keeps track of everyone else and trusts that someone will eventually keep track of her. She went back to the syrup dispensers. Nathan sat with both notebooks and the weight of what he now understood he was going to have to do. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and the first real light of a clear Montana morning was coming through the diner windows and falling across the counter and the empty chair and the coffee mug that was warm, as it always was, as it had been for 15 years. The most faithful small act in Silver Ridge, maintained by a woman who understood better than most that showing up was the whole of the thing. Nathan spent 3 days making phone calls. He used the motel room's small desk and his own cell and the notes from both notebooks, and he worked through it the way he used to work through a pre-mission intelligence package, methodically, without rushing, building from the most accessible contacts outward toward the harder ones. He started with the names he'd gathered himself, the ones with phone numbers he'd gotten from Carl and Margaret and Darnell and the truckers. Then he worked through Evelyn's notebook entries, cross-referencing names against what he could find, current addresses, business listings, the occasional social media profile for the younger names. He was not a man who had ever been comfortable asking for things. The course had trained the asking out of him, replaced it with the expectation that you handled what was in front of you and you did not require assistance with it. His therapist in Missoula had spent the better part of a year pointing out, with the patient precision of someone who had heard that particular story many times, that what looked like self-sufficiency from the outside was sometimes just the refusal to let anyone close enough to matter. He made the calls anyway. He told each person the same basic version of the same basic thing. Evelyn Brooks was still at the Summit Lantern Diner in Silver Ridge. She had been there for 45 years. She had kept track of the people she'd helped. Nobody had ever done the same for her. He was trying to fix that, and he could use their help if they were willing. Most of them said yes before he'd finished the sentence. A few of them cried, not dramatically, just the quiet, surprised sound of people being reminded of something they had let themselves forget. The way you forget the weight of something you put down long ago and don't pick up again until someone hands it back to you. By the end of the 3rd day, he had commitments from 23 people. By the end of the 4th, 31. He hadn't told Evelyn any of this. He wasn't sure how she'd receive it. He'd thought about it from multiple angles and kept arriving at the same conclusion. She'd try to stop it, not out of false modesty. Evelyn didn't do false modesty, but because she'd spent 45 years making herself useful and functional and invisible by design, and someone deciding to make her visible would feel, to her, like a disruption of the order she'd built. She'd call it unnecessary. She'd say the people had their own lives to get back to. She'd find 6 practical reasons why the timing was wrong. So he didn't tell her. He told Danny. He told Roy. He told Carl Briggs, who turned out to know the current building owners in Billings and could make a phone call of his own. He told Logan Pierce on a Thursday morning in Logan's office with the door closed. Logan's office was the size of a large closet, which it had originally been. There was a desk with a monitor and a shift scheduling board on the wall, and a whiteboard with the week's specials, and a single chair on the visitor's side that Nathan took without being invited. Logan looked at him from the other side of the desk with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being walked in on and was deciding how to respond to it. "I need 5 minutes," Nathan said. "I'm in the middle of 5 minutes." Logan sat back. He was 26, Nathan had confirmed. 26 years old, managing a diner he'd been posted to 8 months ago by the corporate owners in Billings, in a town he hadn't lived in before, running a staff he'd inherited. Nathan had not come to this meeting with contempt for him. He'd come trying to remember that Logan Pierce was a young man given authority too fast with not enough context, which was a situation Nathan had seen kill better men than Logan in environments considerably less forgiving than this one. "Evelyn's been here 45 years, Nathan said. Logan blinked. That was apparently not what he'd expected. "I know that." "Do you know what that means in practice, what she does here?" "She's a senior employee. She's been around a long time. She runs the building," Nathan said. "Not officially, not on paper, but everything that functions here functions because of what she does before you get in and after you leave. The inventory, the prep, the gap coverage, the institutional knowledge, the reason your regulars come back is because of her. The reason the kitchen doesn't fall apart when you're short-staffed is because of her." He paused. He You've been managing around her and criticizing her in front of customers, and you don't actually know what she does. Logan's jaw tightened. That's a strong... It's accurate. Nathan kept his voice level. I'm not here to get you in trouble. I'm here because something is going to happen in this diner in about a week, and I need you to know what it is and why, and I need you to not fight it. A pause. What's going to happen? Nathan told him. The calls, the people coming, what he was planning in terms of the space, the evening, what he'd asked Carl to handle with the building owners. He laid it out the way he'd lay out a mission brief, objectives, timeline, key personnel, resources needed, expected outcome. Logan listened. His expression went through several phases. Surprise, skepticism, something Nathan couldn't immediately read, not resentment exactly. More the look of someone recalibrating in real time, finding that the numbers weren't adding up the way they had. The building owners agreed to this? Logan asked. Carl Briggs knows the main partner. Yes. And these people are coming from everywhere in a 4-state radius, some farther. Truckers, former employees, families she helped. One woman's flying in from Portland. Nathan paused. One of them is a man whose daughter was the kid she fronted a pharmacy bill for in 2016. He tracked down the date in an old email. He's been looking for a way to say thank you for 8 years. Logan was quiet. Nathan watched him. He'd seen the look before, not on managers, but on junior officers who had just been shown the gap between their map and the terrain, between what they thought was happening and what was actually happening on the ground. It was an uncomfortable look. It was also, in Nathan's experience, the beginning of competence. What do you need from me? Logan asked. It was the right question. Nathan respected him a small amount more for landing on it. The dining room, closed to public, Friday night starting at 6. Whatever kitchen support you can give, and I need you to be there. He held Logan's eyes. Not as manager, as someone who's going to listen. Logan looked at the scheduling board. He looked at the desk. He looked like a young man doing a rapid internal accounting of something. Costs, risks, the specific exposure of having it confirmed in front of witnesses that he had been missing something fundamental for 8 months. Yeah, he said. Okay. Nathan stood. He was at the door when Logan spoke again. Cross. A pause. Is she going to be okay with this? Nathan thought about it honestly. I don't know, but I think she needs it whether she's okay with it or not. He went back to the dining room. Evelyn was at the counter, refilling salt shakers. Atlas was under the corner booth, patient and still, watching her. She collapsed on a Saturday. Nathan was not there when it happened. He'd driven to Missoula for the day. Supply run. A meeting with his therapist that had been scheduled for 2 weeks. The practical adult maintenance of a life. He got the call from Danny at 2:47 in the afternoon, and Danny's voice had the particular flatness of shock, the flatness of someone who has just been shown what they'd been ignoring. She's in the ambulance, Danny said. She went down in the break room. Roy found her. What happened? They think dehydration, exhaustion. Danny stopped. Nathan, she was covering 3 stations today. Kelsey called in sick, and we had the church group reservation, 40 people, and nobody told her to stop. We all just kept asking her to. I know, Nathan said. He was already moving toward the truck. Which hospital? Valley Medical, in Hardin. I'm coming. He drove 90 miles in just over an hour, which was faster than was advisable on a 2-lane Montana highway in winter, and which he did not think about until he arrived, at which point he noted that he had arrived, and that the highway had been fine, and that the calculation had worked out, and that the calculation could easily have not worked out, and he filed that under the long list of things to discuss with his therapist at a later date. The emergency room at Valley Medical was small and clean and smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and Danny was in the waiting area when Nathan came in, still in her diner apron, having apparently not thought to take it off before driving here. Roy was beside her, his big hands in his lap, his face carrying the particular guilt of a man who has been very near something happening and is trying to determine exactly what his role in it was. How is she? Nathan asked. Stable, Danny said. Dehydration, low blood pressure, exhaustion. They said she'll be okay. They want to keep her overnight. Nathan sat down. Atlas settled at his feet. She fought the ambulance crew, Roy said. Told them she had a lunch service to finish. Nathan said nothing. She covered for Kelsey, Danny said. Her voice had the quality of someone trying not to collapse something they've been holding carefully. She covered for Kelsey, and then Maria went home early because her kid was sick, and there was nobody in prep. So Evelyn went and did prep, and then Logan asked her to help at the register because the line was out the door, and she stopped. We all kept asking her, and nobody asked if she needed. Stop, Nathan said. Not harsh, just clear. You didn't know. Now you know. That's what happens next. Danny wiped her face with the back of her hand. Roy looked at the floor. From down the hall, muffled by two sets of doors, Nathan heard the diner-specific mix of sounds that emergency rooms also run on. The hurried footsteps, the intercom, the mechanical hum of things that keep other things running. He thought about Evelyn in a hospital bed at the end of a shift that had been too long by 6 hours, fighting the EMTs out of reflex, asking about the lunch service. He thought about 45 years of this, the way the system had arranged itself around her without ever once asking whether she could carry all of it. The way people call the thing that holds everything together foundational, which is another way of saying buried, invisible, taken entirely for granted. A doctor came out at 4:15. Young woman, efficient, with the particular economy of motion of someone who manages a high caseload and has calibrated every word to its necessity. Mrs. Brooks is resting, she said. She's stable. The dehydration's being addressed. Blood pressure is coming up. She's going to be fine. Can we see her? Nathan asked. Are you family? He paused half a second. I'm the closest thing she's got here. The doctor looked at him, looked at the dog, made a judgment call. 2 people, 10 minutes. She needs sleep. Nathan and Danny went in. Roy stayed in the waiting room. The room was small and beige and lit by the overhead fluorescent and a band of late afternoon winter light from a window that faced the parking lot. Evelyn was in the bed with an IV in her left arm and a monitor clipped to her finger, and she looked, for the first time since Nathan had met her, like someone who had stopped. Not diminished, just still. She watched them come in. Her eyes were clear, and her expression was the specific expression of a person who has been forced to rest and has not yet decided whether to be grateful for it. The lunch service, she said. It's fine, Danny said. Her voice broke slightly on the second word. She caught it. The church group handled. Danny pulled a chair up to the bedside and sat down. Roy managed it. Logan helped. It's fine, Evelyn. A pause. Evelyn looked at the IV in her arm with mild displeasure. I'm not staying overnight. You're staying overnight, Nathan said. She looked at him. Doctor said so, he added, and you're not in a position to argue with the doctor, or with me. You're not. She stopped, started again. I have things to do in the morning. They'll be done. Logan doesn't know the Saturday inventory protocol. He'll figure it out, or he won't, and the diner will survive one imperfect inventory morning. Nathan pulled the second chair and sat across from Danny. The diner will survive without you for 1 day, Evelyn. What it will not survive is what happens if you don't take 1 day. She looked at him steadily. Her jaw was set in the familiar way. But there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Not vulnerability, not weakness, but the particular look of someone who is very tired and has just been given permission to admit it and is fighting the permission harder than they fought the tiredness. I'm not used to sitting down, she said finally. I know. Samuel used to. She stopped, looked out the window at the parking lot. He used to say I moved like I was afraid something would fall apart if I stopped. I told him that was because things did. A pause. He'd say, not the important things. The room was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped its steady report. He was right, Nathan said. She didn't answer. She turned her head back from the window and looked at the ceiling and said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. The summit lantern felt different without her. Nathan drove back to Silver Ridge late that afternoon and went into the diner and felt it the moment he walked through the door. Not empty, not failing, because the staff were managing, they were present and working, but something was off in the way that a working space feels off when the person who understands it best has been removed from it. The coffee station had been restocked, but not in the right order. The prep board had items in the wrong sequence. 2 of the booths had been set with the silverware reversed. Small things. The kind of things nobody noticed unless they knew what they were looking at. Logan was behind the counter. He'd been there since the ambulance had left, apparently. Still there, not in his office, actually on the floor, covering gaps and running the register and doing it with the specific stiff effort of a man who is doing something he doesn't know well enough to do easily. Nathan sat at the counter. Logan poured him coffee without being asked, which was a first. "How is she?" Logan asked. "Stable. They're keeping her overnight. She'll fight about it." "Yeah." Logan put the pot back on the warmer. He stood behind the counter looking at the dining room with an expression Nathan hadn't seen on him before. Not the managed, performed authority of his usual floor presence. Just a man looking at a room and finally seeing it properly. "Henderson came in tonight," he said. "Regular. He usually just sits and goes. Tonight he asked me where Evelyn was, and when I told him, he just sat there for a minute. Then he said, 'She helped your family out during the 2009 winter?' And I said, 'I wasn't here in 2009. And he said, 'She helped mine.'" Logan paused. "And then Maureen Teague came in and said the same thing, basically. And then a guy I've never seen before came in for takeout. And when I told him Evelyn was in the hospital, he told me she loaned his trucking crew $140 in 2014 to cover a fuel shortage, and he'd been meaning to come back." He looked at Nathan. "I've been here 8 months, and I didn't know any of that." Nathan drank his coffee. "The thing is," Logan said, and now he sounded less like a manager and more like someone who was going to say something that cost him something to say, "I knew she was good at her job. I just didn't—" He stopped, restarted. "I was looking at what she couldn't do anymore. The speed, the heavy lifting. I was looking at what she used to be able to do, probably, and seeing what she couldn't do now, and I was holding her to some standard that didn't account for—" He stopped again. "For what she was doing the rest of the time," Nathan said. Logan looked at him. He was 26 years old, and the expression on his face was the complicated, uncomfortable expression of someone who has just understood something about themselves that they won't be able to unknow. "Yeah," he said, "for what she was doing the rest of the time." The diner moved around them, the evening crowd coming in, Roy managing the back and Danny managing the floor, and the machine of it running imperfectly and adequately, which was the best it could do tonight. Logan refilled Nathan's coffee. "The thing Friday," he said. "What do you need me to do specifically?" Nathan pulled out his notebook and turned to the page where he'd written the plan. "Sit down," he said. "I'll walk you through it." Eat done. By Thursday evening, 47 people had confirmed. The number had grown past what Nathan had planned for, which happened with operations that had genuine momentum behind them. He'd had to call Carl back twice to expand the headcount, and Carl had handled it with the equanimity of a man who had spent his whole life in a town where things were organized through personal relationships and phone calls, and the understanding that when someone needed a favor, it would be returned in time. The photographs had been organized and printed. Nathan had taken the originals from storage with Evelyn's tacit permission and driven them to a print shop in Hardin, had them scanned and enlarged, had ordered simple frames. 22 photographs covering the diner's history, Evelyn's history inside it, Harold Mercer in the early years, and Samuel at his chair, and the decades of people and events and moments that had never been formally commemorated because nobody had thought to do it. He'd written the plaque text himself, in the motel room, and rewritten it 4 times. The final version was simple. He'd learned from the notebook that simple was what lasted. Evelyn Brooks, the heart of Summit Lantern Diner. Not a date. Not a list of accomplishments, just the truth, stated plainly. He'd had it made by a woodworker in Silver Ridge named Pete, who had been in Evelyn's notebook under a 2012 entry, which Nathan had found appropriate. Danny called him Thursday night. "She's home," Danny said. "She got released this afternoon. I drove her. Good. She asked me 3 times if the walk-in had been inventoried. What did you tell her? I told her yes. Which is true, kind of. Logan did it. It was slightly wrong, but it was done. A pause. She also asked me if something was going on. She said the diner felt different when I was there. What did you say? I said everything was fine. A longer pause. Is she going to hate this? Nathan thought about the parking lot 3 weeks ago. The cardboard box. They eat better when it's there before they see it's needed. He thought about the chair, the mug, 45 years of showing up. No, he said, she's not going to hate it. He wasn't entirely certain of that, but he said it anyway because some things needed to be said with conviction even when the data was incomplete, and this felt like one of them. He closed the notebook and looked at Atlas, who was asleep at the foot of the bed with the heavy, uncomplicated sleep of a dog who has done his job well and knows it. Nathan turned the light off. Outside, Silver Ridge was quiet under a clear sky, the first clear sky in 3 weeks, the stars sharp and cold above the Montana dark. Somewhere 2 blocks down the strip, the Summit Lantern's orange sign blinked its patient signal at a highway that was empty this late, its light falling on a parking lot where one old chair waited inside for an old woman who would be back on her feet before she should be, and who would ask about inventory before she asked about herself, and who had been keeping the coffee warm for 15 years because showing up was the whole of the thing. Nathan Cross lay in the dark and thought about that, and about what Friday would bring, and about the fact that he'd driven into Silver Ridge 3 weeks ago in a blizzard with nowhere to go and a dog that wouldn't stop staring. He fell asleep before he'd finished thinking it through. Friday came in cold and clear, the sky the particular hard blue of Montana winter mornings when the storms have finally moved on and left the air scrubbed clean behind them. Nathan was up at 4:30, not from anxiety, or not only from anxiety, but from the old pre-mission wakefulness, the body's understanding that something significant was happening today and that the hours before it required preparation. He fed Atlas and ran through the checklist in his notebook and made 3 calls to confirm logistics and then drove to the diner at 6 a.m. and spent 2 hours with Carl and Pete, the woodworker, and Danny and Roy setting the dining room up in the way he'd planned it. The photographs went up first. Pete had built simple wooden frames, the kind that looked like they belonged in a place like this. Not gallery polished, not precious, just solid and right. They went along the back wall in chronological order, the earliest ones on the left, moving through the decades. Harold Mercer grinning over a new grill. The booth in 84 packed shoulder to shoulder with what looked like a whole county's worth of highway workers. Evelyn young and dark-haired and midway through some task she'd never stopped for the camera for. Samuel at the counter, the chair, the coffee. The diner across 40 years and the woman who had been its constant through all of them. The plaque went above the pass-through window, center of the wall, where anyone sitting at the counter would see it. Nathan hung it himself and stepped back and looked at it and decided it was right. Evelyn Brooks, the heart of Summit Lantern Diner. He'd had Pete wrote the letters instead of engraving them, so they had depth. You could run your finger through each one and feel the word. He didn't know why that had seemed important. It had. By 8 a.m., the dining room was set. By 9, the kitchen was stocked, and Roy had a prep list that was designed to feed 60 people a real meal, not a catered event approximation of 1. By 10, the first of the out-of-towners had begun pulling into Silver Ridge, and Carl was at the motel helping coordinate who was parking where. Nathan stood in the dining room in the finished space and looked at what they'd built and felt the specific unsteadiness of someone who has spent weeks working towards something and has now arrived at the point where the working is over and what happens next is out of his hands. Atlas sat beside him. The dog looked at the photographs on the wall, then at Nathan, then at the door. Yeah, Nathan said. I know. Chum. He picked Evelyn up at 11. She was at her house on Clearwater Street, a small 2-story with a green door and a porch that needed one board replaced, which Nathan noted automatically and then noted that he'd noted, which was a sign of something he didn't examine closely. She was waiting on the porch when he pulled up, which meant she'd been watching for him, which meant she was nervous, which she would never admit. She was dressed carefully, not formally, a dark blue blouse and good slacks, her white hair pinned back the way she wore it for work, but neater, more intentional. She had a coat over her arm, and she put it on while she came down the porch steps, and she looked at Nathan's truck, and then at Nathan, with an expression that was somewhere between resolution and suspicion. "You're not going to tell me what this is," she said. "No? You've been planning something for 3 weeks." "Yes." She looked at Atlas in the back seat. The dog looked back at her with his customary calm. She opened the passenger door and got in. They drove without talking for the first minute. The town moved past the windows, the hardware store, the pharmacy, the bar, the 2 churches, and then at the end of the strip, the Summit lantern with its orange sign and its parking lot. That was, Nathan watched her see, significantly fuller than it should have been for a Friday morning when the diner was supposedly closed. "Nathan," she said, "give it a minute." "There are a lot of cars." "I know." "That's Bob Pruitt's truck." She was leaning slightly forward. "And that's the Hendersons." A pause. "Why are the Hendersons here?" "They're supposed to be in Billings this weekend." "They rescheduled." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You called all these people?" "Yes." He pulled in and parked and came around to her side. But she was already out by the time he got there, standing in the parking lot looking at the vehicles. Some she recognized. He could tell by the way her eyes moved, the small, involuntary identifications. Some she didn't, and those were the ones he watched her pause on. The unfamiliar plates from Spokane and Billings, and one from Portland, trying to work out the connections. "How many people?" she said. 49, last count. She looked at him. Her face was very still in the winter light. "Nathan." "I know. I don't—" She stopped, started again. "I don't need—" "It's not about what you need," he said. "It's about what's true. And what's been true for 45 years that nobody has said out loud." He looked at her steadily. "Let people say it." She held his eyes for a moment. He could see the argument forming and dissolving and reforming and dissolving again. The practical objections, the deflections, the long habit of directing attention away from herself. Then Danny opened the front door from the inside and the noise came out. Voices. The sound of a room full of people who've been waiting. A warmth that was audible. And Evelyn looked past Nathan at the open door, and whatever argument she'd been building simply stopped. They went in. The dining room was full in a way it had never been in Nathan's 3 weeks in Silver Ridge. Not the ordinary full of a Saturday breakfast rush, but the specific, dense warmth of people who have come from a distance to be in a particular place at a particular time. The way rooms fill when the occasion is actual and not manufactured. Nathan watched Evelyn stop in the doorway. She stood there for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to take in the photographs on the wall, her own face, younger and younger as the eye moved left, across the full span of a life lived in this building. Long enough to see the plaque above the pass-through. Long enough for the room to register her arrival and go quiet in the layered way of a crowd, suppressing its impulse so that something real can happen. Then Bob Pruitt, who was nearest the door, said, "Morning, Ev," and the room breathed again. They came to her in ones and twos, which was Nathan's doing. He'd asked Danny to spread the word that it wasn't a mob greeting situation, that people should let it happen at its own pace. Most of them respected that. Most of them found their way to her over the first 20 minutes in the natural order of who was nearest and who had known her longest and who needed to say their thing most urgently. Carl Briggs shook her hand with both of his and didn't say anything for a moment, just held on. Bob Pruitt told her about his hip, which was better, and thanked her for the meals she'd covered when he'd been unable to work and too proud to ask for help, and she'd arranged it so he hadn't needed to ask. The Hendersons brought their daughter, 15 now, too young to remember whatever it was they owed Evelyn, but old enough to understand she was being brought here for a reason. Nathan stayed near the door and watched. He watched Mick and Catfish and Dave come in from the parking lot in a group, still in their trucking jackets, and saw Evelyn's face change when she recognized them. A specific shift, the recognition of people associated with Samuel, people who had known him, people who connected her to a time that existed only in the marbled notebook and the chair and her memory now. He watched Mick say something to her that Nathan couldn't hear from across the room, and watched Evelyn put her hand briefly on Mick's arm and nod. He watched a woman he didn't recognize, early 40s, dark coat, had driven from Portland, Oregon, which was a 9-hour drive, wait patiently near the back wall until the crowd thinned and then cross to Evelyn and say something that made Evelyn go still, and then reach up and press her hand briefly to her own mouth before lowering it. The Portland woman was talking quietly, and Evelyn was listening with the focused, total attention she gave to everything, and after a moment she nodded, and the two of them stood close together and talked for several minutes while the room moved carefully around them. Nathan found out later that the Portland woman's name was Teresa Marguerite, the same T. Marguerite from the 2016 notebook entry, the one who had needed pharmacy money for a sick child. She had driven 9 hours to say thank you for a debt that had been repaid years ago, because, as she told him later, the money had never been the thing. The thing was being seen. The thing was someone acting like you were worth the help before you'd proven you deserved it, and that was the thing you carried with you, whether you wrote it in a notebook or not. Logan spoke at 12:30. Nathan hadn't planned for Logan to speak. Logan had asked 2 days before, and Nathan had said yes because he'd heard in the asking that it wasn't a management decision or a PR calculation. It was a young man who understood he owed something and had decided to try to pay it. He stood at the front of the room with his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor for a moment before looking up, and the room gave him the quiet he needed. "I've been the manager here for 8 months," he said, "and I want to say something directly." He looked at Evelyn, who was sitting at the counter, actually sitting, the first time Nathan had seen her sit voluntarily during working hours. "I came here thinking I understood how a diner worked. I thought my job was to keep things efficient, manage costs, keep the staff in line." A pause. "I spent 8 months looking at this woman and seeing a liability, seeing someone slow, seeing someone I had to work around instead of someone I was working because of." His voice had a rough quality to it, not quite cracking, but close. "That was my failure. Not hers. Mine." The room was very quiet. "I want to say, in front of everyone here, that I was wrong. And I want to say—" He stopped, swallowed. "The things you've done in this building, the things these people have been telling me all morning, I didn't know. I should have asked. I should have looked." He pulled his hands out of his pockets. "I'm sorry, Evelyn, for what it's worth from someone who took too long to figure it out." The room stayed quiet for a moment after he finished. Then Evelyn, from the counter, said, "Logan?" He looked at her. "The matte edge by Storage," she said. "You had it replaced on Tuesday." He nodded. "That's worth something," she said. Simple. Declarative. The way she said everything. Not absolution, exactly. She wasn't handing him that on a plate. But acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that he had heard and had done the specific thing the hearing required. He nodded again and sat down, and someone near the back started clapping, and then the room followed. But the stories went on for 2 hours. Nathan had expected it to be organized. He'd envisioned something almost like a debrief, structured, sequential. What happened instead was the natural shape of people who had things to say and found, once the first few had said them, that the room was safe enough to say theirs. A mechanic from Hardin talked about a Christmas week in 2010 when he'd been stranded in Silver Ridge with an engine failure and no money, and Evelyn had kept the corner table open for him for 4 days, feeding him, letting him use the diner's phone and phone book to find parts, and then, when the parts arrived and he still didn't have cash for the motel, quietly arranging for him to sleep on a cot in the storage room without ever making it into a production. He'd driven this route ever since, specifically to stop at the Summit Lantern. He had a wife now, 2 kids. He'd named the second one Eleanor, and when his wife had asked why he liked that name, he'd said he'd tell her the whole story one day. He told it today instead. A former waitress named Gina, who'd worked at the diner for 3 years in her mid-20s and was now running a restaurant of her own in Spokane, talked about how Evelyn had taught her, not by instruction, not by anything formal, just by example, that hospitality was about paying attention, that people came into a diner because they were hungry, but stayed because someone saw them. She said she ran her kitchen on that principle, and she wanted Evelyn to know where it came from. An older man Nathan didn't recognize stood up near the window and said he'd known Samuel Brooks from the I-90 corridor in the mid-90s, had driven the same route for 2 years running. He said Samuel used to talk about his wife the way most people talked about a fixed point. Not romantic, not sentimental, just certain. He said she was the most competent person he'd ever met, the man said. He said she could run anything. He wasn't wrong. Evelyn had been holding herself very still through most of the room speaking. Nathan, watching from his position near the door, had noticed the careful stillness and understood what it cost her. She was not a woman who received well. She had spent so long directing care outward that the reversal of it required a kind of muscular effort, holding still and letting it land instead of deflecting it back. She was doing it. Imperfectly, visibly effortful, but she was doing it. Nathan spoke last. He hadn't planned to speak at all. He'd planned to stay near the door and watch and drive Evelyn home afterward and consider the mission complete. But somewhere around the 2-hour mark, when the room was beginning to find its natural end, Danny caught his eye from across the room and gave him a look that said clearly, "You have to say something." He walked to the front of the room. He wasn't a public speaker. He didn't have a gift for it, and he knew it. He stood in front of 49 people and looked at Evelyn at the counter and said what was true. "I'm not from here," he said. "I drove in 3 weeks ago in a blizzard looking for a meal. I had no reason to stay." He glanced down at Atlas, who was sitting calmly to his left. He had a reason. "I followed the dog." A small, brief sound of laughter from the room. "What I found, what I've been sitting in this diner watching for 3 weeks, is someone who has been doing the most important work in any room she's in, every day, without anyone measuring it, without anyone keeping track except her." He paused. She kept track. That notebook of hers, those 200 names, those 20 years of entries, is one of the most complete accounts of a life I've ever seen. She documented everyone she helped. Nobody documented her. He looked at the photographs on the wall, at 45 years of this woman in motion in this building. "I spent 18 years in the Marine Corps," he said. "I've known what it is to be invisible by design, to do the work that holds everything else together and have nobody above you see it because the scene would require them to understand what they'd been taking." He looked back at Evelyn. "What you've built in this place, not the building, not the business, what you've built in these people, in all of us, that's the only kind of structure that actually lasts. You don't build it with materials. You build it by showing up every day and doing the thing that needs doing without waiting to be asked." He stopped. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that someone noticed." The room was very quiet. Evelyn was looking at him. Her eyes were wet. She was not going to cry. He could see that she had made the decision not to, and that she was enforcing it with the same refusal to yield that ran through everything she did. But she was close enough to it that the effort was visible, and the visibility was its own kind of honesty. She nodded at him once. He nodded back and went to his spot by the door. After the speaking, people ate. Roy had put out the best meal the Summit Lantern had produced in recent memory. Not fancy, not restaurant sophisticated, just the diner's actual food made with attention. Beef stew and biscuits, roasted chicken, a corn chowder that Evelyn had given Roy the recipe for years ago and that he'd made correctly for the first time today. People filled plates and filled the booths and the counter stools and 2 long tables that had been pushed together from the storage room, and the dining room ran at its warmest for an hour and a half. Nathan ate standing near the back. Atlas was under the counter beside Evelyn's stool, head on his forepaws, watching the room with the satisfied calm of a dog who has completed the thing he knew needed doing. At some point in the middle of the meal, Nathan noticed Evelyn get up from her stool and walk to the far end of the counter, to the chair. Samuel's chair. She stood beside it for a moment, the way she always did, not touching it, just present beside it. Then she reached out and took the framed photograph that Nathan had placed there earlier in the day. Him and Pete had done it while setting up, a copy of the last photograph Nathan had found in the storage box. Samuel in the chair, Evelyn visible through the pass-through, neither of them knowing the camera was there. She held the frame in both hands and looked at it. Nathan watched her from across the room. He didn't go over. He understood that there were things that required distance to happen properly, that the closest form of respect was sometimes staying where you were. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, holding the photograph. Then she set it carefully back on the chair seat, not on the counter in front of the chair, where the coffee mug went, but on the seat itself. An occupant. A presence. She adjusted it twice until it was level. Then she turned back to the room. She had made a decision about something. Nathan couldn't have named exactly what. Not closure, because that was the wrong word for what a person did with 20 years of loss. And not moving on, because she wasn't going anywhere. More like the specific act of expanding the definition of what was allowed to be there. The chair and the mug and the ritual remained. They'd always remain. But now there was a photograph on the seat, and the photograph had been placed there by her own hands, and that was different, and she knew it was different. And she walked back into the room and sat down at the counter and accepted a bowl of Roy's chowder from Danny without comment. Gina from Spokane sat beside her, and they talked for 20 minutes in the easy way of people who had known each other well in a different chapter, and returning, that the knowing hasn't entirely left. People began to leave around 3 in the afternoon. They left the way people leave when they've come a long way for something real, slowly, reluctantly, with the specific quality of not wanting to be the one who breaks the room. The goodbyes took time. There were numbers exchanged and promises made, and at least 2 people who had not known each other before today and discovered, in the course of conversation, that they had adjacent histories in the diner's orbit and were going to stay in touch. Mick shook Evelyn's hand and then, apparently deciding that wasn't enough, hugged her briefly and awkwardly and then walked out fast. Catfish just nodded from the doorway. Some communication passed between them that required no further translation. Teresa Marguerite from Portland was one of the last to leave. She stood with Evelyn near the door for a few minutes. Nathan watched Evelyn press something into her hand. He couldn't see what, something small, and saw Teresa start to protest and Evelyn stop her with a look. Teresa laughed, which was the unexpected sound of someone caught off guard by something that could only be Evelyn doing something for someone on her way out the door of her own celebration. He found out later it was the marbled cover notebook. The small one, not the big spiral one. The one with the pocket entries. Evelyn had written Teresa's name on the inside cover and told her to start her own. But by 4 o'clock, the room had thinned to a few stragglers. Carl and his wife finishing coffee, Roy cleaning the kitchen, Danny wiping down the tables with the slow post-event exhaustion of someone who has held tension for hours and is only now allowing it to release. Logan was stacking chairs. Nathan watched him do it for a moment. The manager, with his sleeves rolled up, doing floor work, no performance in it, and then went and picked up the other end of a table. They moved it together in silence. "You staying in Silver Ridge?" Logan asked. "Don't know yet. Motel lease run out." "End of the week." Logan set his side of the table down in position. "Danny's leaving in March. Going to Missoula for school." He picked up a chair. "I'll need someone who knows the floor." Nathan looked at him. Logan shrugged with the careful nonchalance of someone making an offer they don't want to push. "Just saying, if the road's not calling." Nathan picked up 2 chairs. He didn't answer. He set the chairs down and looked at the room. The photographs on the wall, the plaque above the pass-through, the photograph on Samuel's chair, the mug, the light coming through the frosted windows low and gold and winter thin. He thought about Missoula, the apartment, the lease that renewed automatically, the shape of a life that had been waiting for a shape. He didn't answer Logan, but he also didn't say no. Evelyn was still at the counter when the last car left the parking lot. Nathan sat beside her, not at his usual corner booth, but at the counter, 2 stools down, which felt right for today. Atlas lay between them on the floor, claiming the space the way he claimed important spaces, with complete relaxed certainty. The diner was quiet. The late afternoon light was doing its particular thing to the windows, the angle of it in winter making the glass look liquid, the world outside softened and amber and still. "You have people," Nathan said. She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "You've always had people. You just didn't let them look at you." She picked up her coffee mug, held it in both hands the way she always did when she was thinking. "It's easier to look outward," she said. "When you're looking outward, you don't have to wonder what people see when they look back." "What do you think they see?" She was quiet for longer this time. "An old woman," she said, "who can't carry as much as she used to." A pause. "Who's been hanging onto a chair and a coffee mug for 15 years? That's not what they see." She looked at the photograph on the chair. At Samuel's face, clear and still in the frame, turned toward the kitchen, toward where she would have been. "I know," she said again, softer this time. "I heard them." Nathan drank his coffee, the bad diner coffee that he had developed a genuine tolerance for, which was either an achievement or a warning about the nature of adaptation. "He would have liked this," Evelyn said. "Samuel, he liked when the room was full." She paused. "He always said the diner was my place. I said it was ours. He said—" She stopped. A small sound, not quite a laugh. "He said it was yours, Evelyn, and I'm just the man who gets to come home to it." Nathan said nothing. "He was right," she said. "He usually was about the important things." They sat in the quiet for a while. Outside, the parking lot was empty again, the light going slowly out of the sky. Inside, the photographs looked back from the wall. Decades of this woman in this building, and the plaque held its simple statement above the pass-through, and the photograph on the chair held the man who had ended every long run by pulling that chair up to that counter, because this was where home was, and home was wherever she was. Atlas made a small sound, shifted, put his head back down. "You didn't have to do this," Evelyn said. "No," Nathan agreed. "Why did you?" He thought about it honestly. He thought about the blizzard and the parking lot and the 3 minutes he'd sat in the truck looking at the warm light through the frosted glass. He thought about a dog that wouldn't look away, and a man who'd learned, 18 years too late and one country too far away, that the things worth looking at were usually the things everyone else had stopped seeing. "Because Atlas noticed you first," he said. "And Atlas is never wrong." She looked at the dog. The dog looked up at her. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, the same way she'd been doing it for 3 weeks, slow and certain, without making a production of it. "Good dog," she said. She went back to her coffee. Nathan went back to his. The orange sign above the door blinked its patient signal at the empty highway, and the chair held its photograph, and the mug held its warmth, and the room held everything that had happened in it across 45 years of one woman showing up before anyone else, and staying after everyone left, and building, without blueprints, without recognition, one small act at a time, something that turned out to be the kind of structure that 49 people would drive across 4 states to stand inside. The quietest acts of kindness often leave the loudest legacy, and the people who built that legacy deserve to hear it said out loud, at least once, before time makes saying it impossible.